Welcome back to KTN Weekend Prime. This is the other Kenya. Now, much as the Charlie Hebdo attacks happened on another continent, the resonating consequences of that attack have come all the way into Kenya, and the discussions around what specifically that attack meant both for the people who are attacked and the people who they represent, as well as the attackers and the voices of criticism against Charlie Hebdo and that is really the right to offend and other issues around living through terror. How do we speak about terrorism in this day and age when it is confronting us and it is upon us in Kenya, in Africa? Why was there a discussion, or why was there a protest around Charlie Hebdo and none for the people in Nigeria, or much closer home, the people in Mandera who passed away late last year? To help us through that discussion, I have three guests with me this evening. I've got, to my extreme right, Bwana Ibrahim Lithome, who is a scholar and a sheikh. Thank you very much for joining us, Bwana Lithome. We've also got right in the center there Njeri Thorne. She is a political communications consultant. Hope I got that one right, Jerry. Yeah, and right next to me, I've got a new face to KTN, but not a very new face to security circles. His name is Sir Neo Rogi Branson. He's a global intelligence chief for G8, as well as a cryptographer. Cryptologist,
cryptologist, same thing.
Yes? Yes. All right, hope I'm glad I got that one right. We'll start here with you. And let's try and paint a picture about what the trends are now in terms of terrorism. We saw two attackers step into the Charlie Hebdo offices and kill just over 10 people, and the subsequent attacks that took place in France, leaving more than 17 people dead. Is the lone wolf now the new threat in terms of terrorism?
The facts is simple. We are at war. And we are at war with the people who have no regard to human rights. They have no regard to Bill of Rights or any kind of freedoms for civilians. They are out there to make it known that they want to pass on an ideal, their own interpretation of what they've read in the holy books, to perpetrate attacks on innocent civilians in the name of achieving a mindless goal that in the end leaves a lot of people dead.
Yeah, in so doing, are those lone wolf attacks like we've seen with the Mumbai attacks? You can call it something like...
Actually, as global intelligence, we believe that these are connected. Call it Boko Haram, call it ISIS, call it Al-Shabaab, all of them are connected. And that's why we came up with a network where we actually try to gather intelligence on all the terrorist networks all over the world. Because in a way it's a global terrorist network, and their goals are the same. They are targeting innocent civilians in the name of religion.
All right.
But in actual sense, there's no part of their religion or the holy books, the Holy Quran, that indicates that if you kill a certain civilian, you're actually doing it in the name of God.
Yeah, but it seems these days that, especially when you look at the character of terrorists that have perpetrated attacks like the Charlie Hebdo attacks and others around the world, as well as the ghost that is Samantha Lewthwaite, you find a very interesting character, and that seems to point at the fact that terrorism is, as an ideal, is franchised. So I might not necessarily belong to Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab, but I espouse their ideals in my little place on earth and go and perpetrate my attacks based on that sort of idealism. Do you think that now we are facing a far more dangerous threat because you don't necessarily need to belong to the parent group to become a terrorist?
That's actually, it's a deadly fact, and it is actually true that anybody can actually carry out these attacks based on whatever they have come up with.
Yeah.
And actually the motive of these people is not actually to carry out the ideals of a certain group. They actually go on with creating fear among people, and in the end their main motive is to create conflict between religions and cause war. But the thing is, the fact of the table is, we are at war with very dangerous people, And some of us may not be interested, like, for example, Africa. You actually indicate that there were protests in France, take, for example. In Nigeria, nothing. In Kenya, nothing. Why? Because apparently, to some individuals, to some civilians, this is not my war, therefore I should not take no interest. But the truth of the matter is, you might not be interested in terrorism and counter-terrorism, but terrorism is interested in you.
All right, a great place for you to pick up, Jerry. We saw hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people marching in Paris against the Charlie Hebdo attacks. We'll get into the nuance of whether that Je suis Charlie movement really is a misnomer or really represents everything to do against terrorism. But he poses a very interesting fact. A lot of that, over less than 20, around 20 people killed, but none of that here, where we bear a huge burden, a huge brunt of terrorism. As last year, almost 160 people dead in Kenya alone from terror attacks. Why is it that there is no unanimity, you think, around terrorism?
If we can use the recent Boko Haram, I think that was the most relevant comparison.
Yeah.
It happened around the same time, and of course the figures were significantly high, and we should have paid more attention to it. But the first thing we need to recognize as media, it's enormously challenging to report from Baga itself. First of all, it's quite isolated. Journalists are targeted by Boko Haram, and of course they've cut off all connections, so we're not going to be inundated with the imagery that usually sort of makes us feel, which is what media has done with the Charlie Hebdo scenario. So that's the first thing. Also, Charlie Hebdo happened before. So, of course, the global consciousness, the collective consciousness was focused on Charlie Hebdo. And we have to be aware that media or mainstream media is linked with sort of a geopolitical power agenda, and they will push the narrative of the West until we want to carve our own narrative, and we as Africans decide that we're going to use our media to do so and stop following the global media agenda. We're not going to raise attention, not unless the West wants to make it prominent.
The geopolitical perspective towards coverage of terrorism is very interesting in that we've seen a number of issues become African issues, taken on as African issues on the continent. For instance, the International Criminal Court issue, where President Uhuru Kenyatta, standing before the International Criminal Court, was able to garner the support of not only presidents, but even on the ground quite a number of people. But when it comes to the scale, as represented in Baga, as represented in different parts of the continent, aside from the geopolitics of it,
the local politics there as well. In Nigeria, it's an election year, and Goodluck Jonathan has been criticized for not bringing this to attention of people and not talking about it. In fact, he actually commented on Charlie Hebdo before he did on Baga.
On Baga, yes.
But of course, he doesn't want to draw attention from the voters to the fact that this insurgency has occurred under his management. So there's also sort of political things affecting it. I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but
you see that the thing about Baga and in comparison to Charlie Hebdo is that Charlie Hebdo, much as it happened in an area that is accessible to media, a lot of the conversations around Charlie Hebdo were organic. Are we not connected enough in Africa to be able to have those organic conversations around that? It was very well orchestrated
as well. It was very well managed and put together, and it was a great thing. It was a good platform for comfort, for outrage, but it was very well organized. There's a lot of agendas being pushed in this. It's been anchored on a core value of Europeans.
Yes.
But of course, it helps them manufacture consent for a number of initiatives, whether it's stringent immigration rules or for them to be a little harsher in their take on terrorism.
Let's localize that discussion, actually, because similar discussions have in fits and starts happened here whenever terrorist attacks take place. The We Are One initiative right after Westgate was forged to unify Kenyans, but it never really took. Ibrahim, why do you think that discussion, or rather that movement, never really took a root in Kenya outside of the Westgate attacks? The We Are One sort of initiative to try and unify people against terrorism?
I think, John, I would like to answer that from a Muslim perspective, because we as Muslims, we feel that it was localized to some extent. Anybody who was following whatever was happening in the main mosques in Nairobi and Mombasa would know how much we were affected by it. But of course, it did not go to the level that it was in France. But I think something like that happening anywhere in the world, I think all of us who love peace and who love the rule of law, I think we should be united together. But I don't know why it did not take that dimension here in Africa. But for us as Muslims, we were very much concerned. I don't know whether, John, you're aware that 2 local papers decided to replicate whatever was there and even reproduce some of those cartoons here. And there was an outcry here in Kenya. We at Jamia Mosque had to talk to some of the media houses and tell them that it's wrong for you to do this, because much as we are against what happened to Charlie Hebdo, the terrorist attacks, much again as we are not comfortable with them producing this kind of cartoons that ridicule a person that we hold in respect, but again we feel it was wrong for them to come and reproduce these things here locally.
The defenders of civil liberties in France would say to your argument that why is it that whenever people from the Muslim faith get offended when people go out and draw pictures of Muhammad or ridicule the Muslim faith, why is it that there is a violent response as opposed to other religions? That is what defenders of civil liberties in France, quite a bit of them and quite a bit of the people behind the Je suis Charlie movement are saying.
John, I want to say here very bluntly, I see a lot of hypocrisy when people talk about these rights. Number one, as a lawyer, I'll tell you with certainty, there is nothing like absolute freedom in this world. Every freedom has a limit, including in France itself. We know that one of the sons of a former president of France decided to move away from the religion of the parents, and somebody decided to put that in the media, and they were stopped from doing that. Why? Where was that freedom then? Immediately after the 3 million copies of Charlie Hebdo with the cartoons were printed there, there was somebody who was arrested there for saying that I feel like Coulibaly. He was expressing his freedom, but somebody said, no, you are exceeding the limits. So let nobody try to treat us that there is something called absolute freedom. There can never be absolute freedom. And particularly when you are talking about people's faiths, when you ridicule a person, a certain section of the community or the human beings in this world, 1.6 billion people in this world hold that person as their leader, carrying a message. It means by ridiculing him, you are ridiculing the message. And by extension, you are also ridiculing the person who sent that person, the person we believe sent him, and that is God. So what was the purpose? What is the purpose of doing that? John, your freedom to express yourself stops where my rights begin. So express yourself, but don't shout fire in the middle of a cinema hall. You can't do that.
That's true.
So we're saying freedoms have limits.
Jerry, let's pick that up.
Freedoms, even the right, freedom of expression, which is protected and promoted under the European Convention on Human Rights, there's actually limitations, express limitations on it. The first one being for national security, the second one being to prevent crime and disorder, and then very importantly, the third one, which applies to this scenario, to protect other people's reputations and their rights. And if you put things into context, what's happening here, it's no longer freedom of speech because you're denying people social equality. If you understand the stereotyping and the Islamophobia that is there within the West, you are reinforcing negative stereotypes of an already marginalized, disenfranchised community. And that's why you will find they're susceptible to being radicalized. They may be members of international terrorist group, but it's not that you have to sort of be a member and pay a monthly membership. It's simply pleading allegiance and you're there. But these are people who have no sense of identity because it's taken away from them within the society that they live in. We have it's not an absolute right, the freedom of speech or expression, but what is an absolute right is the freedom of thought. So the minute you're doing this, you're impeding on my right to have that thought because I'm being ridiculed to have that thought. And that is an absolute right. The freedom of thought. It's absolute, non-derogable. You cannot move that.
All right, let's bring you in before I ask my next question. Where does, and I think Jerry has answered quite a bit of this, but where does my right stop in my expression of my dislike, for instance, of your religion, and how is this affecting the war on terror?
I believe that everybody has a right to express themselves in any way possible, and but there's no justification for whether you're offended by what somebody has, the way somebody has expressed, whatever ideas somebody has put in through. There's no right of you to strap yourself with suicide vests and C4 explosives and blow up 100 people or 1,000 people.
No, there's
kill
no
innocents. There's no justification for that.
Yeah.
So I believe that if you can choose to ignore, because I believe every man is equal and is born equal. And if I may quote Prophet Muhammad, he said, all mankind comes from Adam and Eve. No Arab has superiority over a non-Arab, and no non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. No white has any superiority over black, and no black has any superiority over black, except through piety, which is taqwa, and good action. So you're going to be offended by anything that has been put forward on your religion and react to it by killing innocents. I think that is totally wrong.
But is that a representation of the wider Muslim faith, really?
No, actually, I don't believe so, because not at all, actually. Global intelligence, actually, we have chosen to differentiate between radicalization, extremism, terrorism, and Islam. They are not the same. Islam is not. There are people who are actually this radicalized terrorists and extremists are hiding under Islam. Actually, most of them are peaceful people, but these are people. The extremists are hiding
behind the faith to perpetrate
and
these kinds of attacks.
Now that's where we come in to try and isolate them and counter them. But you see, the problem is when you counter these people, now the entire community comes in and protests.
All right, just before you go on, I want to throw this out there and ask. A lot of people who have followed this have been wondering about this very question, about where my rights end and yours begin. But where is demonizing the kind of offensive cartoons, because they're being called offensive by quite a number of people, that were published by Charlie Hebdo? When is demonizing that leading people down the path towards self-censorship and censorship itself, as in general? Let me start with you.
John, I think in all fairness, I have to respond to some of what has been said here.
Okay.
When you talk about when we counter terrorism, then the reaction of the community is this. I want to say here with certainty that sometimes the very manner in which counter-radicalization or counter-violence extremism is done or contributes to terrorism itself, the manner that it is handled. Take, for example, this issue of cartoons. Nobody would want, as a true Muslim, will not support violence the way it was reacted. And that's why yesterday in the mosques, we announced that, okay, we have been offended, but we don't want to be foolish. We don't want to react foolishly. Islam does not tell you to pay evil with evil. And we took an example of the Prophet, may peace be upon him. He was persecuted by his own people. He was beaten by his people. But when an angel of God asked him, can we punish these people? He said, no, forgive them, because I believe they are doing this because they don't know. So we believe in the first place that should have been the reaction. And this is what we are calling for. When I am offended, there is a way of reacting without causing a bigger evil, like killing innocent people. That's wrong. But then when you talk about, when you are countering, then the whole community stands up because you get it wrong completely. The way it is being done. Counter-radicalism, instead of it contributing to peace, it's actually aggravating. For example, there is a time when 3 KDF soldiers were gunned in Garissa. The next day, a whole marketplace was gunned down. Was burnt down. I want to believe the burning down of the market, in the absence of clear information who burnt it, the people are bound to interpret it as the government doing it. I want to believe it created 100 other Al-Shabaab, because the youth who were earning their living from the market, they feel if the government can do this to us, I'm not saying here that the government did it, but when there is no information coming up, they are bound to believe that maybe it's the government.
But there has been absolute evidence that in its reaction to the war on terror, the government has, through its security agencies, perpetrated certain abuses of rights that would create what Lithoma is talking about. What is the right way to be able to handle counter-terrorism without alienating the people who are believed to be targets in terrorism?
In all fairness to the government and to all the intelligence agencies locally, because we actually liaise with the intelligence agencies in the region. First of all, before we give any information to any local law enforcement, you usually conduct a thorough intelligence gathering. I'll give you an example of a mosque in Mombasa where grenades were found and weapons, and some individuals were also arrested. Before that mosque was raided, there was a thorough investigation and intelligence gathering. In what sense? I'll give you one. There's a technology that has been recently adopted by the East African nation, the drone glider satellite, which actually uses thermal and infrared technology. It can scan through a building and be able to isolate everything. So before any place is raided by the government, they have actually be a proof beyond reasonable doubt that actually there's something going on. That's one, as far as the weapons are concerned.
Yes.
Number two, as far as radicalization is concerned, this, if I may touch on the security bill, the part of intelligence gathering where you keep tabs on all conversations that go on around. That same technology, you can swipe conversations and teachings that are going there. Before we target one sheikh or one intelligence given about one individual radicalizing young people, normally there's thorough intelligence gathering and reasonable proof before anything is carried out.
Jerry, I'd like you to chime in on this discussion.
I think it's quite a touchy subject, because the real solution to terrorism is to rationalize it, to understand why it's being done, which nobody wants to do, because in essence you're glorifying it and giving sort of justification to it. But that really is to in my opinion, the way to go about it. Why is this happening?
But can we have a discussion like that in this society that is so divided along lines of you're either with us or against us, versus people who feel grievance in the way terrorism is being handled? Is there a middle ground?
Our discourse should be focused on ensuring that people aren't disenfranchised. There's no constituency that is susceptible to the radicalization, because that's how homegrown terrorism happens. It's a matter of needing a sense of belonging. So let's not marginalize, let's not ridicule. I don't want to say let's rationalize. I could probably get in trouble for saying that, but that lies at the heart of solving terrorism globally. The current methods, I mean, there's been splinter groups. If we think back from 9/11, it was just Al-Qaeda. I can't count on both hands and feet how many we have now as splinter groups. So it's clearly not working. People don't want to admit this, and they don't want to rationalize it, and that's the problem right there.
That's globally. Locally as well, you think?
Locally, the issue of terrorism is definitely a threat for a number of reasons. And as I say, the most important thing is to make sure that we don't have youth being radicalized as a constituency, and therefore no homegrown terrorism.
All right. Lithoma, I'd like to end with you.
John, let not anybody feel that there is somebody glorifying, or there's a community that glorifies or justifies terrorism. We as Muslims do not do that. Again, we have to tell the world it is not a monopoly of any religious group. Throughout history, different religious groups have perpetrated violence and radicalization. But what I want to say here, if we are sincere about ending violence, extremism, and radicalization, we need to candidly deal with the drivers. And this is what my sister here is mentioning. We need to look at the drivers. What are the pull factors and what are the push factors behind this? And what our brother is saying here about intelligence, I've no problem with that, with your intelligence. That is great. But the manner in which the raid was carried out, what do you expect the reaction of a Muslim sitting somewhere in Nairobi or Mandera, seeing soldiers in boots walking into a mosque shown in our media.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that it was wrong for them to be shown in the media. Was there no wiser way of getting those weapons that were in the mosque? In the very same manner in which they had that high-tech technology that he's talking about here,
Yeah.
couldn't you maybe have involved even local Muslim leaders, unless you believe that everybody is supporting weapons in the mosque?
All right.
Let me sitting in Nairobi see the security agencies with due respect to that holy place, because the crime has not been committed by the mosque, it's by people.
By Muslim.
Walk with
yes.
a few sheikhs, a few Muslim leaders, even political leaders. Let the people see them walking there with the police, and according due respect to the place of worship, get those weapons out, arrest the perpetrators.
All right. Neo, your rebuttal as you end. As you wind up, yeah.
One, we gather the intelligence.
Fine.
We give it to the law enforcers. But you will also understand that the same places that the raids are carried out, before the security officers get there, normally the heads of the mosques usually call on to the youth to block, to cause chaos. It makes its way to the media because of those chaos. Now, as far as that control is concerned, anything that is offending you, there's something we call information control. Soon you will not be having all these things, all these negative postings of cartoons on the internet, on the media. That is where the security, it's a global executive order, where anything that is causing rifts between communities and religions will be controlled. They have control of flow information on the internet. They won't be there. That's solution number one. And as far as getting this perpetrators of radicalism and extremism and terrorism, that there's a way that it's going to be done. Initially, it was being done in an amateurish way, but right now
you accept it was amateurish.
It was amateurish. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. But the intelligence was forwarded in real time, and as a result of the reaction of those people that knew gist was coming for them, this law enforcers were coming for them, they radicalized people to block the security officers.
Right.
So I'm not justifying that, but I'm telling you, and I'm telling the people out there, if you know that you are harboring somebody in the mosque that is apparently doing something illegal, why would you allow them to actually influence younger people to...
Neo, in one word, is intelligence working towards getting to the root causes rather than just giving intelligence about attacks? Are you getting to the root causes, in one word, as we wind up, of terrorism, as Jerry has talked about, in terms of trying to rationalize terrorism?
It is working, and we're working towards having ways and means of countering, not only intercepting, but preventing ways and actually providing means and ways of giving people jobs instead of getting into terrorism.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us tonight, Sir Neo Roger Branson from GH, as well as Jerry Thorne. Thank you very much for your insights. And Bwana Ibrahim Lithome, thank you very much for joining us on this discussion. Of course, it's one that we'd like to have for a little longer to be able to really get into the meat of it. But it is something that I guess we'll have more and more opportunities to discuss, hopefully not after an attack like the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Now, in terms of the kind of discussions that we have here on KTN, that definitely always is a point, whether it is about the attacks or the Charlie Hebdo attacks, or far more local attacks that have taken place here. Yvonne Okwara is standing by with a point on this discussion tonight. Yvonne.
Thanks, Janelle. And let's now take a look at that conversation in summary. And these are just some of the key issues that are coming out of that. How free is free speech is the question that is coming out of that discussion. Is it one of the rights that is allowed to infringe on others? Like we've heard, no right is absolute. All rights have freedom. Should there be limits of free speech? And is freedom of speech equal to the right to offend? We're getting a lot of feedback on that, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But those are just some of the key questions that are coming out of that discussion. How free is free speech, and at what point does it begin to offend? Whilst we're not condoning the attack on the Charlie Hebdo magazine, but the question has been coming up in all platforms, social media, as well as mainstream media, and it's something that is driving, including newsrooms, apart. All right. Now, talking about the free speech and the limits to that, or otherwise, we now move to terrorism and understanding the changing tactics of that. Have we fully understood how it works and how it's working now? The emergence of the lone gunman who attacks those who they feel have been offended. Do we understand those changing tactics and the strategies to be able to combat terrorism? The emergence of ISIS, Boko Haram, and of course also the changing tactics of Al-Shabaab as seen in the attacks in places like Mombasa and Mandera. Do we understand these enough to be able to combat terrorism effectively? Because remember, what happened to Charlie Hebdo is not something that is new. We've seen that in Nigeria. We've seen that in very many parts of this country as well. And these are the questions that we are asking and need to understand right now. And the third point that would be important to take a look at is how we go about the fight of terror. Are we alienating certain communities as we go about fighting terrorism in very many parts of the world? The issue that is now emerging is, do we alienate certain communities? Us versus them. You are either with us or against us. I think what we've seen in the Charlie Hebdo attack is you are forced, especially the Muslim community, being forced to say it, or they're not saying it enough is what is being said there. What are some of the ways in fighting terrorism by bringing everybody together so that it's a common fight without alienating one community or another? Those are the key questions we continue to ask, because remember, Charlie Hebdo is something that remains very relevant and something that Kenyans can relate to in our fight against terror. That tonight is the point.